May 7th, 1945. Midnight approaches in a small Bavarian town called Garmisch-Partenkirchen, nestled against the Alps where the mountains meet the sky in jagged silhouettes. The air carries the scent of pine and ash, the ash from burning documents, from hastily destroyed records, from a regime erasing its own paper trail in those final desperate hours. Through the broken window of what was once the town's finest hotel, now requisitioned as American headquarters, the sound of Glenn Miller's In the Mood spills into the street like liquid gold. Inside, under chandeliers that somehow survived the war intact, American soldiers dance. Their boots shuffle against marble floors where Nazi officers had waltzed just weeks before. Outside, in the darkness, German civilians stand watching, their faces pressed against the glass, trying to comprehend a scene that violates everything they understood about conquest and defeat. The dancing would become one of the war's strangest footnotes, a detail mentioned in letters, recorded in journals, captured in photographs that seemed almost obscene in their joy. While German cities still smoldered, while refugees clogged the roads, while the full horror of the concentration camps was being documented mile by mile, American soldiers danced. They danced in requisitioned ballrooms and cleared mess halls. They danced in Berlin and Frankfurt, in Munich, in Nuremberg. They danced with each other when no women were available, and they danced with German women when fraternization rules were ignored or not yet implemented. They danced as if dancing were as natural as breathing, as if victory entitled them not to vengeance but to celebration, as if the proper response to winning a war was not occupation but jubilation. For the German soldiers who witnessed this spectacle, the cognitive dissonance was complete and absolute. They had been trained to see warfare as the ultimate test of national will, a Darwinian struggle where the victor earned the right to dominate and the vanquished accepted their subordination with military discipline. The Nazi ideology had prepared them for many possible outcomes: death in glorious battle, suffering under harsh occupation, even execution as war criminals. But nothing in their ideological framework had prepared them for conquerors who danced. The dancing had begun almost immediately after German surrenders started cascading across Europe in late April and early May 1945. Private First Class Eugene McAuliffe, a rifleman with the 3rd Infantry Division, wrote to his sister in Chicago on May 2, 1945. "We found a phonograph in a house in Munich, and somebody had a few records they'd been carrying since France. We cleared the furniture and just started dancing right there. The German family that owned the house watched us from the doorway like we were crazy. Maybe we were. But we'd been fighting for so long, and suddenly there was music, and it seemed like the only sane thing to do was dance."
The contrast could not have been more stark. German soldiers had marched into battle in formation, their movements synchronized and purposeful, every step a demonstration of discipline and order. When they celebrated victories, it was with parades and rallies, choreographed displays of power designed to intimidate and inspire. The spontaneous, undisciplined, almost anarchic joy of American soldiers dancing seemed to violate the fundamental grammar of military conduct. Here were soldiers who slouched when they walked, who chewed gum while receiving orders, who called their officers by nicknames. And yet these same soldiers had defeated the most disciplined military machine in European history. The equation didn't balance. In a displaced persons camp near Mannheim, a former Wehrmacht officer named Klaus Brenner recorded his observations in a diary that would later be archived at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. On May 10, 1945, he wrote, "They dance. Day and night they dance. I watched them tonight through the fence. They have set up a stage and brought in a band, actual musicians with instruments, as if this were a peacetime summer festival. The women from the town have begun to gather at the fence as well, drawn by the music like moths to flame. The Americans see us watching, and some of them wave, inviting us to join them. Join them, as if we are all simply people who happen to like music, as if there is no blood between us, as if the past 4 years were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding now resolved. I do not know if this is magnanimity or madness. The music itself became a weapon more powerful than any artillery barrage. The Germans had their own martial music, their Wagner and their military marches, compositions designed to stir the blood and steel the spine for sacrifice. American music operated according to different principles entirely. Swing and jazz, the very forms the Nazis had banned as degenerate, carried with them an implicit ideology. Improvisation, individual expression, collaboration without hierarchy, joy without permission. When German civilians heard Chattanooga Choo-Choo or String of Pearls echoing from American positions, they were hearing the sound of a culture they had been taught to despise, now triumphant and irrepressibly alive. The symbolic object that appeared again and again in accounts of this period was the record player, the portable phonograph that American soldiers carried with them into occupied Germany. Unlike weapons or rations, the record player served no obvious military purpose. It was pure surplus, a luxury item that demonstrated the fundamental difference between survival and abundance. The Germans had spent the final years of the war recycling everything, stretching every resource to its breaking point. The Americans brought record players. Technical Sergeant James Calhoun, a supply officer with the 1st Infantry Division, documented the contents of his unit's recreational supplies in a letter to Army Logistics Command in May 1945. Among the items, 47 portable phonographs, 312 records, mostly swing and big band, 18 harmonicas, 4 trumpets, and 2 complete drum kits. This was not unusual. Across occupied Germany, American units carried with them the infrastructure of leisure, not as an afterthought, but as standard equipment, as essential to the American way of war as ammunition and medical supplies. German soldiers watching from prisoner of war camps witnessed something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of military psychology. They had been taught that soldiers needed harsh discipline to maintain fighting effectiveness, that any softness would lead to collapse. Yet here were American soldiers who had fought with devastating efficiency across Europe, and the moment the fighting stopped, they transformed instantaneously into dancers and musicians, as if warfare and celebration were not opposing states, but two sides of the same coin.
The transformation this produced in German consciousness was gradual but profound. In the town of Berchtesgaden, near Hitler's mountain retreat, American soldiers organized a dance on May 15, 1945, barely a week after the German surrender. Local civilians were initially forbidden from attending, but the music drew crowds anyway. They gathered outside the venue, listening to the sounds of Pennsylvania 6,500 and Moonlight Serenade echoing off the mountains. By the second night, some American soldiers began inviting German women to dance, violating non-fraternization orders that officially prohibited such contact. The scene was captured in photographs that circulated widely. American GIs dancing with German women while German men watched from the margins, their faces registering emotions too complex for simple categorization. Defeat, certainly. Humiliation, perhaps, but also something else. A dawning recognition that the Americans possessed something that transcended military might. They had won the war, yet they seemed to harbor no desire for revenge. They had conquered Germany, yet they brought not chains, but music. Corporal Rita Morrison, a nurse with the 95th Evacuation Hospital, described the phenomenon in a letter to her parents in Virginia, dated May 20, 1945.
The Germans watch us dance like we're creatures from another planet. I think they expected us to be harsh taskmasters, to grind them under our heels the way they did to the people they conquered. Instead, we're teaching them the jitterbug. It's the strangest form of psychological warfare imaginable, but I think it's more effective than any punishment could be. How do you maintain your ideology of superiority when your conquerors are this obviously happy? The happiness itself was a weapon. German propaganda had portrayed Americans as weak, decadent, corrupted by materialism and individualism, incapable of the sacrifice necessary for modern warfare. The dancing Americans confirmed some of these stereotypes. Yes, they were individualistic. Yes, they valued pleasure and self-expression. But they had also crossed an ocean to fight a war that didn't directly threaten their homeland, had sustained a multi-front campaign across 2 oceans, and had built the most sophisticated military logistics system in history. The stereotypes were accurate, but the conclusion was wrong. The dancing wasn't evidence of weakness, it was evidence of strength so overwhelming that it could afford to be generous. In June 1945, the U.S. Army Special Services Division began organizing formal dances and concerts across occupied Germany as part of the reconstruction effort. The reasoning was documented in internal memos. Demonstrate to the German population that American occupation would be fundamentally different from Nazi occupation, that democratic societies valued joy and individual expression, that victory didn't require the victors to become tyrants. The policy was controversial. Some officers argued it was too soon, that Germans needed to be taught harsh lessons before they could be trusted with recreation. But the dancing continued, and with it, a slow transformation in German attitudes. A survey conducted by Army Intelligence in July 1945 interviewed 500 German civilians in the American occupation zone about their impressions of American troops. The most common response, appearing in 73% of interviews, mentioned the music. Germans described being shocked that soldiers carried instruments, that they sang while working, that they seemed to find excuses to dance. One respondent, a former Nazi Party member from Stuttgart, stated, "I was prepared to hate them. We were told they were barbarians who would destroy our culture. Instead, they brought jazz. I still do not like jazz, but I am forced to admit it is not the music of barbarians." The record players became a form of currency in the informal economy that emerged in occupied Germany. American soldiers traded records for information, for cooperation, for goodwill. A recording of Benny Goodman could be worth more than cigarettes, more than chocolate, because it represented something beyond material value. It was a passport into a world where music mattered more than ideology, where individual joy was not a privilege granted by the state, but a fundamental human right. The transformation was captured most vividly in Berlin, where American, British, and Soviet forces all occupied different sectors. In the American sector, the sound of swing music became ubiquitous. In the Soviet sector, silence prevailed, broken only by martial music and official announcements. German civilians began voting with their feet, drifting toward the American zones where the music played. The contrast was not subtle. On one side of an arbitrary line, soldiers danced. On the other, they marched. The difference said everything about competing visions of human organization.
Former Luftwaffe pilot Johann Weiss, interviewed in 1983 for an oral history project, recalled his first encounter with dancing American soldiers in May 1945. "I had been shot down over France and spent the final months of the war in a POW camp. When we were liberated by the Americans, though liberation is a strange word for what happened to us, I expected processing, interrogation, perhaps rough treatment. Instead, the first thing I saw was a group of soldiers dancing in the prison yard. They had set up a phonograph on a table and were teaching each other swing steps. I thought I had lost my mind. This was not how victorious armies behaved in my experience. Later, I understood. They were showing us that they had won not despite their individualism and joy, but because of it.
A society that could produce soldiers who danced in prison yards was a society with resources we could not imagine. The dancing infected even the ruins. In cities where 80% of buildings had been destroyed, where survivors lived in cellars and subway tunnels, American soldiers cleared spaces and danced. They danced in the rubble of Hamburg, in the bombed-out opera house of Dresden, in the skeleton of the Reichstag. The contrast between the destruction and the joy was almost obscene, yet it carried a message that propaganda could never convey. Life continues, beauty persists, joy is not canceled by suffering. By August 1945, as the occupation settled into routine, the dancing had become normalized. German dance halls reopened under American supervision with strict rules about behavior and interaction. German bands began learning American music, studying the syncopations and improvisations of jazz. Young Germans who had grown up forbidden from listening to swing now lined up to attend dances organized by American special services. The transformation was not complete. Many older Germans resented what they saw as cultural imperialism, and the fraternization policies created bitter tensions. But the pattern was established. American occupation would be characterized not by harshness, but by abundance, not by vengeance, but by an almost promiscuous generosity that seemed to flow from inexhaustible reserves. The record players, those symbols of American surplus, transformed from instruments of cultural warfare into agents of reconstruction. Studies conducted by American psychologists attached to the occupation forces noted that Germans who attended dances organized by Americans showed significantly more cooperative attitudes toward denazification programs, more willingness to accept democratic reforms, more openness to reconsidering the ideology that had led them to ruin. The dancing didn't erase the past or absolve guilt, but it created a space where a different future became imaginable. In September 1945, photographer Margaret Bourke-White captured an image that would become iconic: an American soldier dancing with a German woman in the ruins of Cologne, the destroyed cathedral visible in the background. The soldier is mid-spin, his partner laughing, her dress twirling. Around them, other Germans watch, some with disapproval, some with yearning, all with the recognition that something fundamental has shifted. The photograph appeared in Life magazine with the caption, "Victory's Aftermath," but what it really documented was the moment when military triumph transformed into cultural contact, when conquest became conversation. The transformation the dancing produced was not instantaneous conversion to American values. Germans did not abandon their culture or their identity because they heard swing music. But they did begin to question the totalizing ideology that had told them joy was weakness, that individual expression was dangerous, that culture must serve the state. When they saw American soldiers dance while their nation burned, they witnessed a fundamental reordering of priorities: life before ideology, joy before discipline, the individual before the collective.
The sound of music became the sound of occupation, and in that occupation, the seeds of reconciliation were planted. The Marshall Plan would rebuild the infrastructure, the democratic reforms would reshape the government, but the dancing accomplished something more subtle and more essential. It made Germans see their conquerors as human beings who valued the same fundamental pleasures, who celebrated victory not with cruelty, but with joy, who brought with them not chains, but record players. Decades later, German historians would identify this period as the beginning of the Federal Republic's transformation into a Western democracy. They would point to political reforms, economic aid, military integration through NATO. But in the memories of those who lived through it, another narrative persisted: the memory of watching American soldiers dance in the ruins, the sound of Glenn Miller echoing through destroyed cities, the sight of record players appearing in military supplies as if music were as essential as food. These memories carried their own truth, that America's greatest weapon was not its military might,
but its unshakable belief that human beings deserved not just survival, but joy, not just peace, but celebration. The record players are mostly gone now, donated to museums or discarded as obsolete technology, but the pattern they established persists, the understanding that freedom manifests not just in political structures, but in the right to dance without permission, to make music without state approval, to celebrate individual joy without ideological justification. The Germans who watched American soldiers dance while their nation burned learned a lesson no propaganda could teach, that abundance and freedom are inseparable, that societies which trust their citizens with joy are societies with strength beyond measure, and that the sound of music in the ruins is the sound of the future refusing to be canceled by the past.